The trait I'd like to focus on today is being intellectually competent. While Canisius prepares its students for college and beyond, I don't mean being intellectually competent in the classroom. I mean being more aware of the world around me, my place within it, and how I should look at each situation that I'm faced with. Becoming more intellectually competent has also helped me become more loving and more open to growth. When I first started here at Canisius, I didn't know a ton of people, and I was missing all the friends I had made in middle school at West Seneca West. Unlike a lot of people, I really enjoyed middle school, so going from being class president in middle school to Canisius was a really hard transition. The hard transition showed in my freshman year grades. Despite running through the motions in school, I dove into Canisius' sports program, trying to become as involved as I could. I played soccer, hockey, and ran track freshman year. Sports allowed me to make a couple friends, but I realized many of my friendships lacked depth. I asked my parents all year if I could just go back to West Seneca and be with my friends, but they told me that I would always regret it if I left without giving myself the opportunity to enjoy Canisius. Close to the end of freshman year, I was caught cheating because I sent a journal homework assignment to someone else and he had copied it word for word. The act was out of character, but at that point I just wanted to make a couple good friends so that Canisius would become everything that everyone had told me it would. I had a very immature outlook on what it took to make friends, so this mistake helped steer me in the right direction. My first turning point at Canisius occurred during the freshman retreat in my small group. On Friday night, we played mini sticks together and got to know one another, which made me feel like I was finally on the right track. The summer going into sophomore year, I started developing a few good friendships I began while playing hockey and soccer for school. I took Nick Calabrese on a family vacation to Maine, which made me finally feel that I was headed in the right direction. My second year at Canisius, I began realizing that I was more intelligent than I was showing in my grades. I had a couple teachers sophomore year that were memorable to say the least, including the infamous Mrs. Smith and Mr. Linda. I really started trying my best, knowing that I would get out of Canisius what I put into it. During the fall of my sophomore year, I signed up for M-House, only because everyone I had spoken to said that the retreat aspect of Canisius was the most valuable. My small group on M-House was a lot of fun, but I left M-House wondering what I truly gained out of the experience aside from a couple days of fun with my classmates. At the end of my sophomore year, I went on June Kairos early. I have a great relationship with my parents, so Kairos didn't affect me the way it affected many of my classmates. I've always told my parents everything, and they have acted as my best friend and mentors more than actual parents, so Kairos was not the first time I reflected. I couldn't tell if my apathy towards Canisius' retreat program was out of a lack of appreciation or if I was just too immature to understand what it was all about. During my sophomore year, I had also been elected to Student Senate, which surprised me because I never thought I would go from knowing none of my classmates to knowing enough to get elected. I ended my sophomore year with a new appreciation for my parents. They had always made me feel open to talk to them, and I didn't realize how great of a relationship I had with my parents until I had gone on M-House and Kairos and heard from my classmates about their relationships with their parents. I realized I had taken my relationship with my parents for granted. These experiences at Canisius helped me recognize and be thankful for the connection I have with both my mom and dad. Later in the year, Sam Sorrentino walked up to me and asked if he could share a locker with me because I didn't have a locker partner and my locker was closer to his advisement than his was. He mentioned that he was going away for spring break and eventually asked if I wanted to come with him and his family. Coming home from Siesta Key with some crazy stories, I became closer with Sam and our friend groups merged, which really gave me my first solid group of guys at Canisius. I went into my junior year thinking it was going to be a grind, but I ended up finding it much easier than sophomore year. Finally understanding jokes about Mr. Rizzo made me feel a connection to Canisius that I hadn't before. Writing the poem for the Christmas assembly with the rest of the junior student senators made me feel like I finally understood Canisius. During my junior year, the health of my grandparents rapidly declined. My grandma Roche had been dealing with early onset dementia, but my grandpa had been able to handle the situation up until this point. My dad, as the oldest son, soon began having to constantly be at my grandparents' house to help them. Often, my dad would sleep there at my grandparents' house or bring my grandma back to my house to sleep, getting up early in the morning to make sure he could get her situated and bring her home before work. Meanwhile, my mom had been working 3 jobs to put my brother and I through Canisius, often not coming home until later in the evening. Seeing both of my parents struggle opened my eyes to their selflessness and love for me and my brothers. In return, I tried to consistently recognize their hard work for me by helping them out with my younger brothers. At 2 a.m. on a Wednesday in December, I woke up to the unfamiliar sound of my dad crying and quickly getting his shoes on. My grandpa had fallen in the middle of the night, and my grandma did not understand what was going on due to her dementia. Without question, I threw my shoes on and ran out the door with my dad to help with my grandpa. That night, I realized that as I grow up, my dad will depend on me just as much as I depend on him. My experiences at Canisius taught me how to embrace this growth and maturity rather than being skeptical. People always cringe at the word brotherhood when used to describe Canisius, but I think it's the best way to understand the loyalty and love we have for each other here. We have each other's backs, and simply being a Canisius student bonds us together. I took much the same approach to my Irish roots. My dad has always stressed what it means to be Irish, but I didn't embrace it until I had experiences with the bond between Canisius students. I see many connections between my family at home and my family here at school. Canisius also gave me an unforgettable experience with my grandfather. After taking care of my grandma for 3 years, my grandpa's exhaustion and sadness finally caught up with him, and he ended up in the hospital. Because my experiences at CHS have taught me not to take things for granted, I went to visit my grandpa every time I could, which usually just included my dad and I, late at night on a school night. I began to think more selflessly, and I disregarded the loss of an hour or two of sleep that I'd lose in exchange for getting to visit my grandpa. Few will ever understand the connection between the oldest Irish son and his dad. My dad was the oldest in his family, and being the oldest son in my family, I wanted to be with my dad every time he visited my grandpa. This December, my dad decided late on a Wednesday night that he was going to see my grandpa. I had a lot of homework, but I went with my dad anyway. Earlier in December, I had found out that my work at Canisius had somehow earned me a spot at Notre Dame, and I had yet to tell my grandpa, who was an avid Notre Dame fan, even though no one in my family has ever gone there. I brought a Notre Dame hat I wore on my immersion trip with me as we went to visit my grandpa, and I gave it to him as I explained that I had gotten it. That was the last conversation I would have with my grandpa as he passed away 2 weeks later. Canisius, demanding me to do my best, gave me a very moving experience with a man that I look up to so much. In June of my junior year, I went on my immersion trip to the Dominican Republic. Being the only student not studying Spanish on the trip, my Canisius experience reminded me to be open to the challenge. On my trip were some of the only students that I hadn't really talked to in my class here at Canisius. I struggled to keep an open mind as I didn't know what it would be like to be in a third world country for almost 2 weeks with a bunch of people I didn't really know. I hoped the experience would be more rewarding than Emmaus or Kairos had been, so I tried my best to go into the trip with an open mind. Some of the people in my group knew each other before the trip, so the pre-retreat and meetings we had before the actual trip were a little uncomfortable, but the trip made it all worth it. While in the DR, I depended on my classmates to help me translate. I worked under the same 100-degree sun, and I saw the same thought-provoking sights, whether they were uplifting or horrifying. We saw how simply the Dominicans lived and how happy they were with what they had, but we also saw extreme poverty firsthand. While working in a Haitian refugee camp handing out food, it was my job to hand out eggs to school children who sang to us as a thank you. After they finished singing, they formed a never-ending line. My stomach twisted, knowing that the pot of hard-boiled eggs that I was holding was not never-ending, and eventually I was going to have to try to explain to a hungry child why he couldn't get food. The time came when I finally ran out, and I felt like I had not gotten even through half the line. The next child in line produced a plastic soldier's gun, one of his favorite toys, as he explained in Spanish. He handed me the toy in exchange for an egg, but I didn't have an egg to give him. He seemed to understand, allowing me to keep the plastic gun anyway, but the split second of disappointment I saw in his eyes before he masked it with a grateful smile completely changed how I saw the world around me. As a child, my parents told me to finish the food on my plate, that people in this world are starving. Hearing that and seeing it in a person's eyes are two very different things. As we drove away, I tried not to cry, but I couldn't help it as the same boy that had gave me the gun smiled and waved as we disappeared down the road. During the one-on-one talk I had with my group leader on the freshman retreat, I talked to him about how I didn't feel like our class was close. I didn't feel like we were all friends. He told me he felt the same way freshman year and told me not to worry, that by senior year, we would all know each other and have a great last year together. These words couldn't have been more true. I came to love my school and all of my classmates by senior year. Our class became more tight-knit than I could have imagined. They say every barrel has bad apples, but I can't name one kid in our class that doesn't love being a Crusader. In 3 short years, I went from wanting to go back to West Seneca to not wanting to leave for college. Canisius isn't about growing individually, it is about growing together as a class and a community. I think through retreats, immersion trips, playing sports, and going to football games, I've not only grown as a man, but as part of this community as a complete person. Canisius educates in ways that other schools don't, which has gifted me with a wholesome high school experience. During our freshman year, Father Betty explained that there are 2 types of students that will graduate from this school. Many Crusaders and a few Canisius students. The difference, he explained, was that Crusaders took away everything they could from their Canisius experience, while Canisius students merely ran through the motions to earn a diploma. Coming to Canisius has been so much more to me than earning a diploma. Had I stayed at West Seneca, I wouldn't have looked poverty in the eyes and learned something from it. I wouldn't have had deep, meaningful conversations on retreats with my classmates. I wouldn't have been able to take on a role as class president. Had I not come to Canisius, I would have no understanding of what it means to work for good grades. I wouldn't know how hard it is to make friends at a new place. Most of all, though, I wouldn't have been able to come into school every day knowing that I'm part of something bigger than myself.